Welcome you back. We're going to continue our study of Daniel here. We're going to be getting into chapter 12. It's really important to understand from Daniel 8 to Daniel 12 is one large story. And so to get into Daniel 12 all by itself is probably to lose a lot of understanding. Daniel 12, if you just read it, if you take a couple years and never read anything in Daniel, never think about it, and just pop into Daniel 12 and read it, it can seem really confusing. But if you take the time to go through Daniel 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, you'll see that there's a story. More importantly, if you look at all of Daniel, because all the way back to Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the statue and Daniel's vision of the beasts, all of that period is important to this story, because what we're looking at now at the last chapter of Daniel, we're looking at the closing of a book, the closing of a story. And that's important to think about because I think that that closing is brought to light in this story. And so, Daniel chapter 12. And like I said, this is a complicated chapter all in of itself. I hope I can do it even any similitude of justice as I try to explain what I see in it. And again, I'm not going to say that this is perfect in any way. It's based on my experience and my studies, the best I've been able to come up with. So, Daniel chapter 12, starting in verse 1 through 4. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even till that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. But thou, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Now, it's important as we're looking at this, it's really easy to want to think that Daniel's getting this vision of our time. And I'm not going to say that it doesn't at all pertain to our time. But this is really the closure of the story in Daniel. The story in Daniel refers to predominantly Babylon, Medes and Persians, Greece, Rome, and then of course the switch from the Roman Empire to the ecclesiastical Rome. This is really what we're talking about, the period of time. And so when he says, there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. Historically, from the time of Babylon forward, even before Babylon, if we go all the way back to the time when Joshua comes into the promised land with the house of Israel, okay, all the way back to that period of time, coming forward up to Christ's time, Israel, even when attacked by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, had a scattering remnant that stayed. Never before were they completely wiped out of the promised land. The whole period of time, we know that Assyria came in and wiped out the 10 northern tribes. We know that Nebuchadnezzar came in and wiped out the 2 southern tribes. There was always a scattering of people from God's people there. Never was it completely wiped clean of believers. That's important. There were times when God's people were destroyed and killed during all of the attacks, coming all the way back from when, like I said, they first came into the promised land, all the way up to the time of the Romans. Many battles, many lives shed, most likely few battles that lost as many lives as when Titus surrounded Jerusalem and starved the people to death. And I highly recommend, if you haven't read it already, to go and study about that period of time when Titus is sieging Jerusalem. Josephus, as a historian, while in no way perfect, is a good place to begin and read about that period of time, because I think it helps us visualize what might be happening in this. Matthew 24 verses 21 and 22, of course, Christ comes out of the temple with his disciples. They're admiring the temple, and he's telling them, not one stone is going to be left on the other. He's talking about the physical destruction of the temple. Now, we know that he's also talking about his own life. He's going to die and be resurrected in 3 days. We understand that. But he's looking at and also speaking of the physical temple. This is going to be wiped out. And the image of it is going to be resurrected in him as the chief cornerstone. That's important because that's the temple that's going to be being built after that point. But in Matthew 24, he looks at his disciples and he tells them in 21 and 22, "For there shall be a great tribulation such as was not since the beginning of the world, to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened." And this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the same period of time, in my opinion, as Daniel is seeing, the time when the temple is going to be destroyed. So we ask ourselves, when was the temple physically destroyed? Because that's what this passage in Matthew 24 begins talking about. And we know, as I said, that was under Titus in 70 AD. He came in, and that period of time was extraordinarily difficult for God's people. Like I said, down to the last remnant of people, they were either wiped out, killed, destroyed, or sent out of the country. And we know that even the name of Jerusalem was changed, and the name of the area was changed. It was no longer Israel and Jerusalem, but it was Palestine, and Jerusalem was changed to Aria Capitolina. And it was prohibited for all believers and Jews to be there. Could not. No reason whatsoever. And so this was a major setback and blow, both to the house of Israel, talking genetics, and the church, the religious part of what God created in the New Testament. It was a very difficult time of trouble. Probably nothing like it, although there have been many things since then that have probably been very similar. But not having lived through that time, it's sometimes hard to know. And of course, adding to that, he keys in another piece that's important. And he says, "And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake and come to everlasting life." Well, when did that happen? Well, Matthew 27, 50 through 53 tells us. And of course, in the Book of Mormon, Christ accentuates this particular moment when he gets out the ancient Nephite record and he's reading through it and he says, "Hey, wait a minute, you're missing something here. Didn't Samuel the Lamanite prophesy about something? Didn't it happen?" And Nephi says, "Yes, actually he did, and yes, it really did happen." He says, "Well, why isn't it here?" And Nephi says, "Well, honestly, I don't know." And he goes and he writes it in. What was it? This here, Matthew 27, 50 through 53. Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared unto many. And so this is this moment, in my opinion, when in Daniel 12 it says, "Many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake." Not everyone. This isn't a generic, general resurrection. This is a very specific resurrection, and that's important. And according to Daniel chapter 12, it's not a specific resurrection of only righteous. It's a specific resurrection of saints. And I think that's important to note. I bring that out for one reason in particular, because of course Daniel mentions that some to everlasting life and some not to happiness. And what I would use as an example for what this is talking about is in the Old Testament, a specific prophet. And I'm not going to go back and read it. I'm just going to paraphrase the story. I'm sure most of us all know it and remember it. But a specific prophet of Israel that was sent to tell a king a specific message. And when God sent this real prophet to the king to talk to him, he told him, "Once you've delivered this message, get out of town. Straight away, get out of town. Don't stop. Don't do anything else, just leave. And of course, we know that as he's leaving, after having delivered the message, another man comes up to him, supposedly a prophet, and says, wait, stop, no. God said you should come to my house and have a meal. And so he says, okay, I'll go to your house. And he goes to his house and he eats with the other prophet. And then the other prophet tells him, this was a test for you. This was a trial. God told you to go straight out and you didn't do it. When you leave here, a lion's going to just eat you. And he leaves the house and sure enough, a lion eats him. Was that guy a real prophet? 100%. Do you think that he had eternal happiness because he disobeyed God? Well, that's something worth thinking about. And I think that's what this passage is talking about, people like that. Not everyone who was resurrected of God's holy people at this moment went on to happiness. But they may have been true believers, every last one of them. And so that's worthy to think about. That's just my view of this particular passage. Back into Daniel 12. Then I, Daniel, looked and beheld, there stood other two, the one on this side of the bank of the river and the other on the other side of the bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And again, I really think when we get into this verse 6, this is important to think about as the story that's in Daniel. Verse 7, and I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, which he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever, that it shall be for a time, times and a half. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. And I heard and I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And so again, we have an end date that defines the period of time. And the end date is when he has accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people. And that's important. Who are the holy people? What's their power being scattered? But this is the end date of the time, times, and half a time in this particular passage. And that's important to think about. So let's continue in verses when he talks about how long shall it be to the end of these wonders. It shall be for a time, time, and half a time. Of course, and to pair with this, I would bring us to Revelation chapter 6, verse 9 through 11. Because to me, this is part of the scattering of the holy people. It's the part of the story we just got done talking about Rome and what Rome did to the believers and to the house of Israel. But in Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 and 11, this is what it says. And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? And white robes were given unto every one of them. And it was said unto them that they should rest for yet a little season, until their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled. And so this is part of that time of trouble. This is the time when the church is being wiped out. Not just the house of Israel. The church is being wiped out and destroyed. And again, this begins under that Roman period. And if you read that Roman period, especially after Christ, each one of the emperors that came after that, the literal thousands of believers that were killed, hundreds of thousands killed. That ties in important to this. But you have two pieces here. One of those pieces is the Old Testament, the house of Israel, the holy people of God. One is the New Testament, the holy people of God. And so when he's talking about the end of these wonders and the time when he will have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, it's kind of important, the wording there of who we're focusing on. So, how long to the end of these wonders? Well, a time, time, and half a time are typically interpreted as a prophetic period that translates to one time equal 360 years, or 360 plus 720 plus 180, or 1,260 day years. The question was, how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? It's my opinion that these are the wonders which are spoken of throughout Daniel 8, 9, 10, 11, and of course, predominantly the whole book of Daniel. The statement was also made when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people. And I think that's important. Now, we can ask the question, is this referring to the house of Israel in Jerusalem, which was overthrown by the Romans in 70 AD, and the last resistance destroyed in 74 AD? Or is it talking about the New Testament church, which lost its authority, its authenticity, authority, and power? My opinion, again, is based on the book of Daniel, this is talking about the house of Israel, not the church. That's my opinion. So, the statement, when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, I think that ties in when we go back to chapter 9, verse 26. And of course, we didn't study Daniel 9 in this study, but in chapter 9, verse 26, that's a very specific event happening. And it says, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. That is Titus, that is the Romans. And the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. So you have this very precise event when Titus comes in, destroys the city and the sanctuary. We know when that happened. We have that date. And that was after Christ's death and resurrection. And so my opinion is this is the date that ends the times, and half times. I think that's important. And so how long shall it be till the end of these wonders, the wonders of Daniel, with the destruction of God's people? The destruction of God's people, as we see on the right side of this slide, the end, he, Rome, accomplished or finished the scattering of the power of the holy people, Israel, and it ended with the scattering of God's people, and this happened between the period of 70 and 74 AD. That was the end of the people of God. So if we go backwards 1,260 years, what do we come to? We come to the date of the beginning of the period, the beginning of our story, so to speak, in some ways. And of course, the beginning of that period would be right around 1185 to 1189, depending on if you're working from 70 or 74 AD. So what's important about 1185 and 1189? Well, the beginning of the story of God's people. Historically, archaeologically, at the moment, again, with knowledge that is currently had, it is believed that Joshua went into the promised land approximately around this year, 1185, or actually be flipped, it'd be 1189 to 1185 BC, when Israel went into the promised land and took possession and became the nation of Israel. And so we have this period of time ending with their destruction. The beginning of the nation of Israel, the end of the nation of Israel. It's accomplished, the scattering of the holy people, and it's all done. Now we have the period of the New Testament, which is not focused on genetics, but rather focused on belief and life. An entirely different thing. God is not necessarily just following one genetic line of people, but it's wherever in this world that believers are found. Back to Daniel chapter 12, verses 9 through 13. And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed to the end of time. Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly. And none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to 1,330 days. But go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of days. And again, this is another point where I think it's important to understand daily sacrifice. It's not always talking about the same daily sacrifice, in my opinion. Now, I might be wrong at that. That's okay. I don't have a problem with that. But to me, this makes a lot of sense when I read it. But it makes a lot of sense as two periods back to back. The daily sacrifice was originally taken away in our story by Nebuchadnezzar. And basically, that was the end of it. Now, in the Old Testament, why do we say that was the end of it? Well, number one, when Nebuchadnezzar left, he took all the temple implements. And number two, the important piece when Nehemiah comes back, and they're taking stock of everything that exists. Of course, we know they take stock of the lineage of the priests that are there, and they come to a priest family that is not in the genetic library at the time. And it is stated, I don't remember who said it, whether it was Nehemiah or whether this is I think it's in the book of Nehemiah. It is stated that until someone stands up with the Urim and Thummim, this family cannot be brought in. They needed another witness. The interesting thing, from the point when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes Jerusalem, when Babylon takes Jerusalem, the Urim and Thummim is lost. There is no historical accounting of it ever after that again. It's gone. And that passage gives us reason to believe that if they had it, which I'm not saying absolutely they did not have it, but that passage is the last passage that talks about it as an active role in the temple, and it speaks about there being a lack of someone to be able to use it. And so whether it's missing or whether there's no one to use it, we know they have high priests after that. But the other interesting thing that we have after the Babylonian period, when they return, is that from that period forward, high priests cease to be called by God and begin to be appointed and assigned their duty. And prior to that time, there was only ever one high priest operating. After that time, we now have multiple high priests sometimes operating at one time. And so there's an interesting change in the dynamics of the temple. And so I would say the daily sacrifice as a legitimate thing before God ended at the time when Nebuchadnezzar came in there and changed the dynamics of the Old Testament church, because we're talking again about the house of Israel, in my opinion, in this story. And so from the entering of Joshua into the land to the end, when Titus comes in and destroys Jerusalem, when is the daily sacrifice taken away? Well, that would be the time of Nebuchadnezzar when he came in. So it tells us that if we're going to use the day-year idea, from the time that the daily sacrifice taken away to the time of the abomination that maketh desolate is set up, we've got 1,290 day years. Now, the abomination that maketh desolate, or as Jesus says, the abomination of desolation, I believe again is a symbolic term. Abomination meaning that it's coming in as an idolatrous power. It is not just an idolatrous power, but it is actively against all things true and actively trying to destroy all things true. And so this is the abomination, and it makes desolate. Why? Because without truth you can't have anything. Everything disappears without truth. And so what you have is a series of events when Rome, an abomination, came in and desolated the temple. It was the beginning of the end, because you cannot have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness without truth. And that's what they were destroying in destroying the people of God. And so even when they remade the people of God into the ecclesiastical Rome, they no longer held to truth. They held to dogma and their own religious ideals. And they begin to change the rules in the church quickly. So if we go back to roughly the period of time of 602 BC to 597 BC, which is about the ballpark time when Nebuchadnezzar came in, depending on the historian you're reading, I think predominantly the date of 597 is held, but I'm not going to say that that is the absolute. It works as far as I'm concerned, but to me, it's a ballpark number. So what we're having here is from this period, the daily sacrifice is taken away in the house of Israel, to a period of time when there is an abomination that makes desolate is being set up. This is a different event. And it is, in my opinion, an event that was in the future for the storyline. So the daily sacrifice being taken away, if we go back and look at what happened in Jerusalem. Jehoiakim died during the siege when Nebuchadnezzar came in, right around the 22nd of Marcheshvan, December 10th, 598 BC, or during the months of Kislev and Tever. Nebuchadnezzar pillaged the city and its temple, that's the important thing, and the new king, Jeconiah, was around 8 to 18. Different texts say different numbers, and his court and other prominent citizens and craftsmen, and much of the Jewish population of Judah, numbering about 10,000, were deported to Babylon. The deportation occurred prior to Nisan 597 BC, and dates in the book of Ezekiel are counted from that event. A biblical text reports none remained except the poorest people in the land, so we can see why the temple sacrifices would end. Also taken to Babylon were the treasure and furnishings of the temple, including the golden vessels dedicated by King Solomon. And of course that story is in 2 Kings 24:13 through 14. The events are described in the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim sections of the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament. In our Old Testament of the King James, 2 Kings 24:10 through 16, we get some of these events. The first deportation was the start of the exile and the Jewish diaspora. And so this is basically the beginning of when the daily sacrifice for Israel ended. Because even when they came back, without someone who could stand up with the Urim and Thummim, you couldn't have a real calling. Couldn't have had high priests, because the high priests in the Old Testament were always a called position. It was unlike the Levitical priesthood, which was passed down by genetics from father to son. The high priesthood was called. And as we know, all the way back in the time of Moses, one of the witnesses to the calling of the high priest was the use of the Urim and Thummim, and being able to get that testimony straight from God. And so this, to me, is when the daily sacrifice was officially taken away. And so from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away to the time forward, 1,290 day years, of course we come to the period of time 688 to 692 AD. And it's interesting, if this is the answer to this math problem, this is the very period of time when the Dome of the Rock was begun and ended. Basically 688 to 692 fits absolutely perfect between those numbers of 602 to 597 BC, the period of time when typically it's thought of as when Nebuchadnezzar did his first siege on Jerusalem and took all the temple stuff out. And so we have this absolute perfect fit either side of the date that you want to take. And I think that's absolutely really cool to look at, because oftentimes when you look at dates like this that you're not 100% sure which one it is, no other date fits well. And this fits either way, because it's considered that the dome was roughly started about 688 and finished in 692. Now, the dome in and of itself to me is insignificant as an object. The significance is what it is. Now you have the belief of the Islamists that, of course, all Christians are infidel and need to be killed. That is a match for what was coming in with Rome, the abomination. And its purpose is to make desolate. It's not a growing purpose. They don't have blessings of God. They live in horrible, horrible situations because of their religious views. And I think that's how it's being focused on here in this passage. And I suspect as we're looking today into the last days before Christ's second coming, this is playing in big time. And of course we see this from 9/11 in the United States when the Twin Towers were brought down. And I think that this is what we're looking at right now, this abomination that's purpose is to make desolate. And I think that's very important to think about as we think about people in government positions who may have affiliations all the way back to this line of reasoning. So we go from the abomination that makes desolate, and it said, blessed is he that waiteth and comes to 1,305 and 30 days. And of course, some people look at that and say, well, is that minus 129? which gives us 1,290, which gives us 45 days, adding it onto it, or what is that? I don't honestly think so. I think that that adds on to the 1,290. And so from the time that the abomination that makes desolate set up, forward 1,335 day years, I think we come into the period of time that means, or where it says, blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the end of this period of time. And I think that's really the pocket of time that we're looking at right now. And of course, we know from prophecy had in the church, we very likely are living in the end of Revelation 16, the seventh vial being poured out, all of these events happening. And on the spiritual side of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue, we have the end of Rome coming today. And that's what Revelation 17 and 18 really focuses on. The two legs of it, that to me will be crushed. One, the financial side of it, that is going to be crushed. One, the spiritual side of it, that's going to be crushed. Again, no longer the Babylon, Medes, Persians, Greece, Rome of physical landscape, but of spiritual landscape. And so when God calls us out of Babylon, there's a reason for it, because this image is coming down. And that's what the story's about. That's what the story was about to Daniel. The image, the whole story, it has a beginning and it has an end. And for those that are willing to wait it out, it's going to be a good end. As it says in Daniel 12, many will be made white, many will be made perfect. And whether or not that's Christ's time, when he died on the cross and was resurrected and many were made perfect, or whether that's today as we come into what I would call the final stretch, I think again many are going to be made perfect and white. And that's just my views between Daniel 8, where we started, and now Daniel 12, where we're finishing out. And so I hope that can inspire you somewhat and maybe give you some other ideas to think about. Again, I no way am saying that this is the absolute right interpretation. It's what I have understood through a lot of research and looking into history. And so I hope it can bless you in some small way. God bless.